Mississippi River, the $12 trillion Mirage that's about to fail. $12.6 trillion of American commerce hangs on a river that keeps changing its mind. Barges sit aground. Salt marches upriver, flirting with the intakes that keep cities alive. Here's where things get interesting. One concrete box decides which delta survives. But hold on, because what I'm about to tell you next makes New Orleans' map look temporary. We told ourselves, we engineered certainty. The river disagrees. The question isn't if control fails. It's who already knows it will, and why they're letting the clock run while contracts, ports, and lives price a promise the water never signed. The Mirage of Control. Start with the number nobody argues with. $12.6 trillion in economic activity rides the Mississippi system. Freight, grain, fuel, chemicals, export schedules, insurance, everything priced on uptime. The river is a calendar and a balance sheet. Miss a week and someone somewhere eats the cost. Miss a season and you discover how many industries are really won. Now get this, the system's single point sits in a quiet Louisiana bend. The old river control structure forces a marriage the river tries to annul every flood. By law, the split stays 70-30, most flow down the old Mississippi, the rest to the Atchafalaya. By gravity, the Atchafalaya wants more. Engineers built concrete to settle the argument. Gravity filed an appeal. The lie was certainty. We called levees, locks, and dredging control. We treated variability like maintenance. Then 2022-2023 pulled the mask. Drafts cut from 11 or 12 feet to 9. Tow sizes shrank. One-way windows, groundings, export penalties stacked. Basis blew out as local prices detached from the global tape. Brazil arbitraged our pain. Spot barge rates spiked roughly 400%. Insurance premiums followed. Credit covenants tightened on fleets built for deeper water and steadier calendars. Every fix cost time. Time cost money. Meanwhile, something else crept upriver. When discharge weakens, salt arrives as a wedge, a dense tongue that slides along the bottom. Intakes have chloride tripwires. Cross them, and you corrode pipes, foul membranes, and wreck industrial cooling. In 2023, Plaquemines Parish lived the warning label, 209 days under saltwater emergency. The Army Corps barged roughly 153 million gallons of fresh water to blend at plants. They built an underwater sill to block the wedge. The salt overtopped it. They built deeper. That wasn't control, that was triage. Here's a detail people forget. 60% of US grain exports move on this river when it works. Grain doesn't wait for your schedule. Harvest hits, elevators fill, and the river decides who ships. When drafts fall, tonnage drops, costs soar, and elevators pay take or pay on contracts they can't meet. The basis blowout wasn't a spreadsheet glitch. It was the price of betting on a map that keeps changing. Financialized geography sounds abstract until you see it in peril. Demurrage ticks. Refineries throttle throughput when stage drops. Petrochemical plants watch chloride lines like EKGs. A stuck toe in the wrong bend becomes a grocer's empty shelf, a plastics shortfall, a fertilizer price spike. The river makes local moments national. To understand the stress fracture, rewind to the choke point. In 1973, floodwater dug a football field-sized scour hole about 50 feet deep beneath the old river control structure. Vibrations were so violent they slammed car doors on the bridge overhead. That wasn't a near miss. That was a preview. We patched, strengthened, and added redundancy, but the bet stayed the same. We can force a ratio on a moving engine. Every high water tests it. Every low water tests it differently. Failure modes aren't theoretical. Extreme flood, extreme low, or both, while salt advances. Put numbers on the consequence. Models peg an abrupt old river control failure at around $295 million per day in immediate losses. That's grain not shipped, barges idle, fuel rerouted, and factories waiting on parts. Add compounding delays, inventory swings, and price shocks. This is before you count how power, pipelines, and port drafts rewire around a captured course that shortens and steepens down the Atchafalaya. Remember, the Atchafalaya is 150 miles shorter and twice as steep. Nature would flip the switch fast, we'd respond slow. But the lie didn't start in 1973. It started when we framed a 20th century design as permanent, locks sized for smaller tows, chambers that force today's fleets to chop and push. Dredge budgets chasing bars that reform after every pulse. We called it routine. Then climate took the routine apart. Droughts that echo 1,000 miles downstream. Rain bunched into bursts. Longer, hotter shoulder seasons that pull more water from the channel and shove more heat into every intake. The river didn't get wild, it got honest. Here's the twist most contracts ignore. We priced river risk like weather, annoying, seasonal, bounded. What 2022-2023 showed is structural. When flows drop, the salt wedge doesn't politely stop at parish lines. When drafts fall, this isn't just more trips. It's fewer options. Floods still come, but low water arrives more often and lasts longer than the old playbook allows. And the fixes? Underwater sills that need rebuilding. Barged water that burns fuel and budgets. Offshore lightering. Fragile pipelines between parishes just to keep kids from brushing their teeth in brine. So what's at stake? Everything that treats the Mississippi as a guarantee. Grain schedules, ethylene strings, ammonia runs, plastics, fuel, insurance models that assumed yesterday's stage and today's subsidy. The river doesn't read those assumptions, it reads gravity. This is the moment everything changed. When the barge quotes hit 400%, the sill was overtopped, and a parish counted the days on a salt calendar. We can keep pretending control is absolute, or we can admit it's probabilistic, expensive, and temporary, and start asking which parts of the system bend now so the rest doesn't break later. Households on the line. Down in Plaquemines, the calendar didn't show months anymore. It showed chloride. For 209 days in 2023, families lined up at folding tables for cases of water, while the parish Facebook page posted the latest lab numbers like weather. A mom named Tasha learned to taste the tap before boiling pasta. If it tickled the tongue, she wouldn't risk the pot. The Corps barged fresh water, tanks beating like a pulse, 153 million gallons blended at plants just to keep pipes from eating themselves. The first sill the engineers built to hold back the Gulf, the salt walked over it. Unknown to them, upriver a tow captain watched green numbers on his draft gauge dip and held his breath through a one-way window. Every hour idling burned peril and patience. His crew slept in 2-hour bites because dispatch might call when wind and stage aligned for a short shot through. He called home from a bend and told his daughter her birthday gift was late. She laughed and said she understood. She didn't, neither did he. On a farm in southern Illinois, harvest hit the bins while barge quotes swung like a heartbeat at 400% last season. An elevator manager started calling growers at midnight when a brief rise promised one more cut at the river. Missed that rise and basis widened, local prices fell away from futures, and the county learned what it means when a river decides your paycheck. The farmer across the table stared at the ticket and switched next year's plan in his head. Corn was out. Beans might ship lighter. Inside a plastics plant near St. James, a night shift tech kept a hand on a warm pump casing as the chloride line inched up. The boss ran a small desal skid hard enough to sing. Cooling towers hate brine, membranes foul, heat climbs. He could feel the strain through the metal. They'd learned to schedule line flushes around wedge weeks the way people elsewhere schedule around snow. A grocery manager in St. Bernard watched shelves pulse with price. A stuck toe in the wrong bend meant the potato chip aisle thinned, the milk delivery wobbled, and the box trucks arrived half full with apologetic drivers. Customers blamed the store. He nodded and comped a few items. What was he going to do? Explain stage to a line of tired parents. The politics of salt turned personal. On a Sunday in Bellechasse, a pastor set 2 jugs next to the pulpit and asked anyone with extra to leave one. Everyone laughed softly and did it anyway. A dialysis nurse kept a list on her phone. Patients moved earlier on wedge weeks, backup generators tested, extra filters on order. She told her staff to bring their kids to the break room during evening shifts. No one trusted the highway when rumors about closures bounced around. Insurance agents started speaking a new language in kitchen chairs. Not wind, not flood, salinity. Policies don't list wedge as a peril, but corrosion claims and business interruption tied to water quality suddenly had a file drawer. Premiums crept, deductibles shifted, people swallowed hard and signed. Meanwhile, across town in Algiers, the Sewerage and Water Board stacked plans on a folding map, a cofferdam to cradle an intake if needed, a pipeline sketch to reach a point upriver where the bottom rises and salt struggles, the Kenner hump. Price tags looked like police budgets. Parents heard those numbers and thought about school roofs and streetlights and still said, "Do it if it keeps the taps sweet." Here's the part that hurts to say out loud. Households adapted faster than paperwork. They stored water in bathtubs, bought filters, traded texts with color pictures of the tap. "This looks off to you." Tow captains collected rumors like tide charts. Farmers slept next to phones and planned around a stage graph. Nurses built wedge calendars beside medication lists. Everyone learned a new skill, reading a river they can't see. And upstream of all of it, the quiet concrete box kept humming. Couples brushed their teeth by bottled water because a structure miles away held a ratio the river rejected. That's when the story stops sounding like infrastructure and starts sounding like a bargain we made without asking the people who'd pay it. The route sits upstream in a quiet bend. The costs show up in kitchens. The origin of the lie. To see how we ended up pricing certainty on a river built for change, go back to when we mistook paperwork for physics. Gravity offered an alternative map. South of the Red and Black Rivers, the Atchafalaya cut a steeper, shorter line to the Gulf. The old Mississippi wandered wide and shallow. The Atchafalaya promised speed. Rivers follow energy. People follow habit. We tried to make habit win. In the 1940s and 1960s, floods wrote warnings in mud. Cut-offs straightened bends to speed flow, levees marched higher, and channelization turned a living braid into a chute. It worked until it didn't. Faster water bites banks and floors, steals sediment from where you need it, and delivers it where it hurts. We solved the last flood by loading the next one with momentum. Meanwhile, a story hardened. If we could keep the river between walls, we could fix a map for commerce and safety. The Mississippi River and Tributaries Project scaled that promise into concrete, gates, and law. Navigation and flood control married into a single choreography that assumed the river would rehearse on cue. On paper, it was elegant. On water, it was conditional. Then Congress took the argument downstream and put it in writing. The 70-30 split was a line in the statute. 70% down the old trunk past Baton Rouge and New Orleans, 30 toward the Atchafalaya. The old river control structure became the gatekeeper, a forced vow in a place where vows never lasted long. Engineers designed redundancy, low sill, auxiliary over bank, later a hydropower plant to hold the ratio through seasons. The river heard until further notice. 1973 arrived like a cross-examination. High water raged, and under old river control a football field-sized scour hole, roughly 50 feet deep, tore open. Vibrations climbed the structure, reached the bridge, and slammed car doors shut. A weird, specific detail, metal mouths clapping without hands, turned into a diagnosis. The river wasn't obeying, it was negotiating. We patched, piled riprap, added capacity, and promised the bet was safer. It was still a bet. Upstream, the lock and dam ladder took shape for a 20th century fleet. Shorter tows, narrower chambers, flows that fit old hydrographs. Dredges kept channels to authorized widths and depths, following sandbars that moved as quickly as budgets. The ritual felt normal, so we called it control. The river called it routine maintenance on a machine we didn't fully understand. And downstream, levees did their job so well they starved the delta. Sediment that once fanned into marshes shot offshore. Land sank without new mud. Passes deepened for bigger ships, pulling salt farther inland with every cut. The irony sat in plain sight. The system that kept navigation open also sharpened the salt wedge's teeth. But here's the quiet origin of the lie. We didn't just build structures, we built expectations. Communities, plants, and ports calibrated capital to a stage and a split. The idea that the river could be fixed in place moved from engineering memos to bond prospectuses, insurance models, and household mortgages. When people say we engineered certainty, they mean we engineered dependence. Climate walked into that dependence like a blunt auditor, not apocalyptic, just persistent. The Ohio and Tennessee sent less water more often. Heat stretched shoulder seasons, pulled more from the surface, and sharpened the bottom density gradient that the wedge rides. Bursts of rain stacked against longer dry spells, stressing both ends of a system sized for narrower swings. None of this makes the engineers villains. They built for the data they had and the politics they were handed. The lie wasn't malice. It was omission, the belief that a contract could outvote geology indefinitely. Once you see that, the 1973 scour looks less like a close call and more like a postcard from the future. This is what the river wants. So we arrive back at the quiet bend where a concrete box hums. The origin of the lie is believing that hum means peace. It means effort. It means cost. It means the river has agreed, for now, to let our story run. The moment we forget the for now, everything else we price on top of it starts to wobble. The choke point nobody sees. Old River controls quiet dictatorship. Drive past the cane fields near Simisport and it looks quiet. Low levees, a few warning signs, a ribbon of brown water sliding by. Beneath that quiet, a dictatorship runs. 4 concrete actors, the low sill, auxiliary, overbank, and the hydropower plant, do one job all day, hold the split at 70% down the old Mississippi, 30 down the Atchafalaya. It sounds like accounting. It feels like surgery performed on a river that keeps trying to stand up. Get this, the choreography changes with the hydrograph. In high water, the auxiliary takes strain, spreading force across gates so vibrations don't stack in one place. In moderate flow, the low sill carries most of the work, bleeding off that 30% toward the Atchafalaya through tiled bays that hiss and boil. The overbank is the escape hatch for floods, a wide swath meant to spill energy before it eats concrete. The hydropower plant is the metronome, turning pressure into spin and spin into kilowatts, steadying head differences the way a drummer steadies a band. They learn the pattern in pain. In 1973, floodwater carved a football field, sized scour hole roughly 50 feet deep under the low sill. The structure shook, energy ran up its bones, and car doors on the bridge above slammed shut from the vibration. Imagine someone clapping your teeth together from the ground. That day became gospel in the control room. You watch the river's mood in the numbers, and you never let it stack that kind of force in one spot again. Failure here isn't a Hollywood collapse. It's more likely a sequence. Extreme flood that eats foundation armor, or a head differential that hammers a slab. Extreme low that pulls unpredictable turbulence around piers and shifts scour where models didn't put it. Or the bad math, low discharge shrinking resistance downstream while a salt wedge climbs, changing density layers so pressure fields don't behave like the book. Every mode asks the same question. Can concrete hold a promise to ratio against flows built to choose their own path? Meanwhile, gravity keeps whispering a shortcut. The Atchafalaya is about 150 miles shorter and twice as steep to the Gulf. If the structure lost authority in the wrong week, water would find that slope fast. Drafts south of Baton Rouge would fade. Pilots would radio depths no spreadsheet prepared. Ports would scramble to dredge where channels no longer mattered. Pipe networks, intake towers, power plant cooling loops, all calibrated to today's river, would discover they were attached to yesterday's. The consequence has a price tag. Immediate losses modeled near $295 million per day when old river control is assumed down. Grain waiting in bins, barges on ropes, refineries throttling, plastic schedules slipping, fertilizer strings breaking, crews on standby. Past the first week, it stops being daily losses and starts being a rewiring job. The grain belt pivots through rail that can't scale. Petrochemical corridors shift to Gulf-side options that don't match their feedstock habits. Insurance adds a new column called Capture Risk. The dictionary gains a phrase, Atchafalaya Premium. Inside the gatehouse, the dictatorship is data. Operators watch river stages at Tarbert Landing and Old River, head differentials across each structure, gate positions by degree, power output by megawatt, vibration spectra that turn concrete hum into alarms. A hydrograph rises on the Ohio. The auxiliary gets ready. A tropical system jacks levels. Overbank plans spin up. A heatwave drains shoulder seasons. The hydropower plant becomes a shock absorber as flows thin and density layering stiffens. They're not deciding where the river goes. They're deciding how not to anger it. Look upstream and you see the ladder built to feed this ratio. Lock and dam releases time to keep flows within lanes that Old River can manage. Look downstream and you see dredge windows, barge drafts, and salinity lines bending around decisions made in that room. It's a quiet empire. No headlines, no photo ops, just the daily veto of physics over ambition. The structure doesn't ask if your plant needs intake water tomorrow. It asks if the force field at its piers feels honest. Here's the irony, this dictatorship is provisional. The river tolerates the split because the structures dissipate energy well enough most days. When they don't, you hear it first in metal. A gate on bay 7 groans a little longer. A frequency in the vibration chart grows a tail. A camera catches a boil where you didn't expect one. You close a bay, open another, shift load, and pretend it's routine. It is, until it is. While the concrete box holds, the other clamp tightens from the Gulf. Low water years build the salt wedge. Engineers throw underwater sills at it like speed bumps for density. Sills work until they're overtopped, as 2023 taught. If Old River is the dictatorship upstream, the wedge is the insurgency downstream. Control in the middle means triage at the ends. So stand on that levee for a minute. Listen to the low hiss of water through bays you can't see. Every truck that rumbles by is carrying parts for somebody's promise. Grain on a clock, plastic on a calendar, paychecks on a draft line. The split at Old River looks like a number. It's really a pact. And pacts fail
Low
first
water crisis
where the math is
when the river
shrinks. While the concrete upstream holds the split, the river does something quieter and meaner. It thins. A drought in the Ohio or Tennessee doesn't announce itself in Louisiana. It just echoes 1,000 miles downstream as numbers that won't climb. Gauge after gauge reports stingy flow. Tug radios lose their old confidence. The channel doesn't narrow so much as it shallows, taking inches off drafts that decide whether a toe moves or waits. Dispatches start with inches. 11 or 12 feet becomes 9. A single foot sounds trivial until you multiply it by a mile of tank barges and hopper barges chained in 12s and 15s. Tonnage vanishes from the math. A toe that cleared a bend yesterday now clears it without 2 loaded empties. Pilots who have spent careers reading boils and sand waves watch for new bars that weren't there last week. One-way windows replace 2-lane water. Meet spots get scripted like air traffic. Every minute idling heats, tempers, and engines. Groundings turn from rumor into rhythm. A tow pint of coffee sits on a wheelhouse console, and the sudden, soft stop sends it sideways. Crews spill out with sounders, tapping the bottom, feeling for a path a yard to port. Linesmen on deck swap jokes that sound like prayers. The radio crackles with apologies and coordinates. Meanwhile, Coast Guard notices push one bend at a time into one-way traffic. The fog of triage settles. Who moves first becomes a story told in drafts, contracts, and who can yell politely. The economics compound fast. Every grounding blocks others. Every lightering step, whittling cargo off midstream to gain an inch burns time. Insurance underwriters call more often. Premiums nudge up for operators with older equipment or thinner balance sheets. Lenders review covenants that assumed certain ton miles and certain hours on the clock. Credit for new barges looks different when your cash flow depends on a river that refuses 2 feet of draft in September. Up in the grain belt, the clock is crueler. Harvest hits when it hits. Elevators fill, trucks coil around country roads. A river at 9 feet draft means fewer bushels per barge, more trips per ton, and schedules that don't line up with futures. Basis blows out as local prices detach from the board. Brazil reads our pain like a weather map and sells into our gap. It's not spite, it's arbitrage. On a loading platform, a foreman stares at a berth that's too shallow and a spreadsheet that won't close. He phones the railroad he swore he'd never call again, then hears about crews and locomotives already spoken for. Alternatives remind you why the river won your bet in the first place. 60% of U.S. grain exports ride this artery when it works. That statistic feels abstract until a single barge misses tide, a vessel counts the days at anchorage, and a buyer in North Africa pays more for a shipload that left later with less. Doctrine meets mud. A farmer in Pike County hears it as 5 cents off on his ticket and wonders why the Mississippi is setting his kids' college fund. Then there's the 2022 lesson nobody wanted, spot barge rates spiking roughly fourfold as water fell. Quotes swung like heartbeats. Elevators with take-or-pay contracts bled. Soy processors swapped crush schedules because beans that were supposed to float to the Gulf were now trickling. Futures screens tell part of it. Warehouse inventories whisper the rest. You can't hedge a river that decides not to show up. Insurance and credit trail behind with their own meter. Underwriters tack on low-water surcharges and ask for more telemetry, draft sensors, AIS discipline, vibration logs on engines working too hard. Banks start putting low-stage triggers in covenants. requiring cash sweeps when gauges linger under certain numbers. Operators who plan to rehab a towboat push it another season and hope the crank holds, because cash that would fix steel is patching a hole in time. The human cadence shifts. Pilots sleep in snatches, waiting for a wind shift that'll blow water into a skinny crossing. Crews learn to read a core dredge's itinerary like a holiday schedule. River pilots start telling younger hands the old stories about 9-foot canals and stiff-backed tugs, only now those stories aren't nostalgia, they're the plan. Coast Guardsmen run markers out farther from bars that shouldn't be there and draft press releases that sound like weather reports. Caution advised, shoaling reported, one-way traffic between miles X and Y. And downstream, the low-water squeeze summons the other enemy. Salt doesn't need an invitation. Thinner flow lowers the threshold, and the wedge begins its patient march, laying a brackish tongue along the bottom that makes intakes blink red. Low water invites salt. Engineers line up sills and barges, while plant managers count gaskets and membranes like rations. You feel a drought in a wheelhouse first, then in a grocery aisle, then in a dialysis chair. Look hard and the pattern is simple. A drop in the Ohio or Tennessee becomes a cut in draft at Greenville, a grounding near Wilkerson Point, a rate spike at Cairo, a midnight call in an elevator office, and a tighter breath in a pilot house at sunrise. A river shrinks quietly, then all at once. Control doesn't compute that curve. Adaptation has to live on it. The saltwater wedge, the Gulf marches upstream. Salt doesn't announce itself with a wave. It glides. When the river thins, a dense tongue of Gulf water slips along the bottom, silent and predictable in its physics, indifferent to parishes and promises. Freshwater rides above, chlorides creep below, intakes sit at fixed elevations built for yesterday's flow. Cross a tripwire 250 milligrams per liter for drinking, and you're not debating taste, you're counting corrosion. In 2023, Plaquemines Parish learned the wedge's patience has a calendar. 209 days under a saltwater emergency. Not storms, not flood. A slow march north that turned the Mississippi into a layered threat. The Corps threw everything that buys time. Barges carried fresh water, about 153 million gallons, down to Port Sulphur and Point a la Hake, where operators blended it to keep chloride lines from blinking red. Temporary reverse osmosis units rattled in borrowed rooms, spitting clean into tanks that emptied as fast as they filled. Then came the speed bump we've learned to install at the bottom of the channel, an underwater sill. Engineers stacked mud and stone into a submerged levee, forcing the wedge to climb thin and lose its bite. It worked until the river disagreed. The salt overtopped the sill. Crews built it deeper. The wedge shrugged and waited for another window. You could hear the lesson in the excavators idle. This isn't control, it's friction. Up in treatment plants, operators watched instruments that most people don't know exist. Conductivity, chloride, temperature stratification across the intake face. Pipes don't just dislike salt, they remember it. Chlorides score steel, invite pitting in welds, and chew through protective films that took years to build. Membranes foul. Ion exchange beds swell and tire. Cooling towers change their chemistry, trading tidy cycles for headaches. Industrial permits, written for freshwater, suddenly read like dares. Cities rehearsed fixes on paper long before they admitted them in budget meetings. New Orleans sketched a 15-mile pipeline to the Kenner Hump, a rise in the riverbed upriver where the wedge stumbles. Price tags, 150 to 250 million, landed like thunder. A cofferdam design sat ready to cradle an intake if the wedge climbed faster than barges could unload. Jefferson Parish tested interconnects, so pumps could push sweet water across lines when neighbors ran brackish. It felt like war logistics. It was maintenance, scaled to a climate that stopped keeping old promises. Hospitals, refineries, and power stations ran their own math. DeSalle skid rentals booked out. Spare gaskets and pump seals doubled on shelves. Maintenance windows moved to cooler nights when chemistry behaved better. One chloralkali plant rescheduled shifts to miss a predicted wobble. A refinery upstream kept a spare heat exchanger wet and ready, its tubes chased for pitting every few days. The wedge turned operations from routine into choreography. And still, the human layer carried most of the adaptation. People stored water in bathtubs not for storms but for Tuesdays. Apartment managers taped notes by sinks. Don't trust the tap for baby formula this week. Churches stacked pallets of bottles near freezers. A barber in Violet told every client to rinse with bottled at home in June because a test strip in his shop turned the wrong color that morning. If you want to understand infrastructure, listen to jokes that aren't jokes. Physics didn't care about any of it. A river's mouth is a conversation between discharge and density. Lower the discharge, the wedge advances. Raise it, the wedge retreats. Widen the pass for deeper ships, and you give salt a smoother ramp. Hard levees that keep floods off streets also keep fresh pulses out of marshes that once diluted the edge. Every fix upstream has a sentence downstream. We just hid the period far enough away to forget it. Officials asked for patience. FEMA opened an emergency declaration, cleared money for barges and equipment, then drew a line 90 days out for cost sharing. That bought relief and a deadline. Plaquemines figured real costs in monthly installments, reverse osmosis units at $850,000 to $1 million per month across plants, plus staff, plus fuel. The wedge turned into arithmetic. Local budgets blinked. We tell ourselves the wedge is a rare event. The graphs disagree. Thinner shoulder seasons, more frequent low-flow stretches, and a delta deepened for commerce tilt the odds toward yearly friction. That doesn't make New Orleans map vanish. It makes it conditional. On sills that hold. On pipelines that reach. On barges that arrive before chloride does, on plans that treat salt not as a surprise, but as a neighbor that knocks every fall. Stand at river mile 65 on a still morning and watch nothing. The surface looks fine. Beneath it, density is drawing a line. The wedge never hurries. It doesn't need to. It knows the calendar. It knows the intakes. It knows the budget. It will come as long as the river gives it room. The question isn't whether we can push it back this year. It's how long we'll pretend pushing is the same as control. The petrochemical spine, America's quiet dependency. Between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, you can drive for an hour and never leave the smell of work. Crackers, reformers, towers that look like cathedrals in steel, ethylene, propylene, ammonia, diesel, jet fuel, an assembly line that starts with molecules and ends with everything on a store shelf. It feels local. It is. This corridor is a national habit built on a single river's rhythm. Feedstock comes by pipe and ship, but the quiet input is water, low chloride, steady temperature, predictable stage. Cooling keeps heat exchangers honest. Steam drives turbines and distillation. A hiccup in intake chemistry isn't a nuisance. It's a shutdown creeping up a gauge. Managers read chloride like pilots read altimeters. Cross a threshold, and you take a unit down before the unit takes itself down. During wedge weeks, the choreography gets tight. One refinery upstream staggers turnarounds to avoid everyone chasing scarce contractors when sills are being raised. A chemical plant in JSMA shifts, runs overnight because membranes foul slower when the sun isn't loading the river. A fertilizer complex trims ammonia rates so condensers don't drift into brackish drift. None of those memos mention fear. They mention safety factors and margins. The message is the same. Keep the molecules moving without inviting an expensive lesson. Draft isn't abstract here either. Barges bring naphtha, aromatics, caustic, sulfur, and take out finished product to blending terminals. When 11 feet becomes 9, you don't simply add more trips. You add idle time at fleeting areas that weren't built to be parking lots. You add lightering midstream with crews you don't have enough of. You add purchase orders for overtime and spare seals. Every ton delayed on the water echoes at a rack where a tanker truck backs up to an empty loading arm. People think we're sitting on the Gulf so we're safe, a night superintendent told me, not looking up from a clipboard. We are safe as long as the river cooperates. He tapped a column labeled intake conductivity. This is the line. When it bends, we bend. He didn't need to say what bending costs. A unit off for 6 hours is cheap. A day is felt. A week shows up in wholesale prices 3 states away. Finance has already adjusted to this reality. Risk teams layer river parametrics onto commodity spreads, ORCS gate positions, Tarbot landing discharge, bellwether salinity at certain intakes. A decision to hedge diesel now includes an assumption about draft a week from today. Insurance underwriters who once cared mostly about windstorm and fire now ask how close your pumps sit to the riverbed, and whether you can swap to surface water from a pipeline neighbor if chloride jumps. A corridor that once promised 99% uptime now prices a few more hours of no. Walk the pipe racks and you feel another dependency. Steam cycle returns depend on cooling ponds that assume freshwater makeup. Raise chloride and corrosion coupons start telling a story you don't want to read. Corrosion eats budgets and patience invisibly until it doesn't. A maintenance planner in Ascension Parish holds up a stub of a failed tube, pitting like a lunar surface, and shakes his head. That's 6 months of running on the wrong side of a line. Meanwhile, the river's stage sets throughput long before wedges arrive. Heat waves bump power demand, river temperatures bump discharge permits. When the water's hot, returning it hotter isn't an option, and cooling capacity defines production, not the market. A petrochemical complex that could run harder in August backs off because the intake warms with the air and the permit isn't a suggestion. The grid feels that dip later when a plastics plant's motor order slips to next Friday. If Old River holds the split upstream, this spine needs it like posture. A capture by the Atchafalaya wouldn't be a scenic detour. Drafts south of Baton Rouge would thin in days. Intake elevations would suddenly be wrong. Dredges would race physics. The corridor would either retool at great cost or watch feedstock and product routes migrate to ports that never planned to absorb them. That scenario lives in slide decks now, not as a threat, but as a decision tree. What do we do if the split blinks? Here's the truth beneath the lights at night. These plants are efficient because the river has been predictable enough for decades. Predictable flow, predictable drafts, predictable chemistry. The corridor's miracles, cheap ethylene, reliable diesel, fertilizer on time, aren't miracles at all. They're habits made possible by a channel we told ourselves would behave. Every time a sill gets overtopped, a barge sits too high in the water, or a chloride alarm flickers at 2 a.m., that habit gets a little more expensive. You won't see it at the pump tomorrow. You will feel it in the price curve a month from now, in the spread between a planned outage and an unplanned one, in a quiet pause on a line where bottles should be coming off fast and don't. This isn't an argument for fear, it's an argument for attention. The river sets the metronome. The spine plays to it. When the beat stutters, production becomes improvisation, and improvisation is costly at scale. If you want to know how close America lives to this water, drive that hour at night. The towers shine because a river lets them. Farm to freight, the grain machine's breaking points. Harvest doesn't ask for permission. One cold front, one stretch of clear skies, and the combines roll. Corn comes first, beans behind it, augers rattling, bins humming, country roads dusted brown. The year's work collapses into days, and every hour adds weight to the problem. The river decides who moves and who waits. At the elevator, the whiteboard turns into a triage chart. Berths are booked, drafts shaved, and the river forecast sits next to futures like a second price. With stage down and 9-foot drafts forcing lighter loads, a tow that used to carry the county's week now carries most of its day. Freight quotes swing like the weather. Last season they spiked to 4 times normal, and the phones never stop. A dispatcher who grew up thinking barge rates were background noise learns to read them like heart monitors. Harvest timing versus river stage is a coin flip with real money on both sides. Get grain to the cut when draft is there, and you capture basis. Miss the window and local bids fall away from the board. The basis blowout people grumbled about wasn't abstract. It was a kid's braces delayed because the elevator had to pay take or pay on a contract it couldn't fill, and the farmer took 5 cents off to keep trucks moving. In the office, a manager circles a narrow rise predicted 2 days from now and starts dialing growers at midnight. If you can get here by dawn, we can load one more string. The county sleeps light and drives early. Rail and truck look like saviors on a map and land as math. Truck miles turn river savings into diesel. Bridges become bottlenecks. Rail crews and locomotives are spoken for by the time a drought echoes to Cairo. A shuttle train is a solution if you got in line months ago. Otherwise, you're paying premiums and explaining to a board how a river 3 states away bent your balance sheet. The alternative is more bins and a longer hold, but bins don't forgive debt, and every extra week risks quality. Inside the drying shed, hot air chews moisture down before grain slips into steel. Run longer and you burn propane that wasn't in the budget. Run shorter and you ship, or try to ship, with dockage a buyer won't take. The trade-off stacks when the river is stingy: more fuel, slower turns, and a queue that snakes onto county roads while a tow idles in a bend 300 miles down. Insurance and credit creep into the conversation. Elevators with thin covenants get calls. Lenders ask about exposure to low-stage clauses in supply contracts. The phrase river risk shows up on term sheets that used to assume it was someone else's problem. A cooperative board that once argued over dividends now argues about whether to invest in more storage, a rail spur, or pray for rain in the Ohio. Out in a township that remembers corn like religion, a micro-story plays out in 5 minutes. A farmer unloads into a pit, watches the ticket print light, and pulls a laminated card from his pocket. It's a simple switch chart, what to plant if the river said no last year. He crosses out corn with his thumbnail and circles beans. Lighter per trip. Maybe they'll move more easily next fall if drafts stay tight. 60% of US grain exports use this artery when it works. That sentence sits on PowerPoints in cities. In a scale house, it feels like an apology. Elevators built on river rhythm weren't designed to hold a crop through a month of 9-foot drafts. When the water gives back an inch for a day, everyone tries to thread the needle at once. Tow queues resemble holiday airports. Any delay upstream cascades into buyers on other continents, and suddenly, a load meant for October slips to November at a price the spreadsheet doesn't like. County pivoting is not melodrama. One township drops corn 10%, grows beans, and offers stalks to a cattleman who can't get feed delivered on time. Another signs a seasonal contract with a processor inland. Grain flows redraw themselves in small lines that add up. You see it in the seed dealer's order, the crop insurance agent's claims, and the guy who sharpens knives on a trailer outside the diner because the packing plant moved shifts around freight. The machine breaks at simple places. A bridge heals too slow after a barge strike in low water. A fleeting area jammed with half-loaded strings. A scale hand who calls in an extra set of trucks on a rumor the core dredge will finish a mile tonight. Fragility isn't a headline. It's a series of small misses that turn a banner yield into a limp margin. Then there's the quiet curse. Every fix costs time. Lightering on midstream flats eats daylight. Swapping to rail eats weeks. Adding storage eats cash. Harvest doesn't stop to admire problem solving, it pushes. And the river, honest in its physics, answers with inches. In those inches, a region's income lives or falls. This is where the story ties back upstream. Old river control hums, the split holds, and yet a farmer in a line of trucks feels the dictatorship in his rearview mirror. The promise of a fixed river let him build this life. The river's answer decides a century-old design. Up north, the river doesn't look like a single highway. It looks like a staircase. Pools held level by concrete, each one waiting on a gate to lift or lower a tow that's longer than a city block. The upper Mississippi and Illinois system was brilliant when men wore fedoras to ribbon cuttings. It still works, just not for the world we built on top of it. Start with scale. Modern tows arrive as 12, 15, sometimes 20 barges lashed into a floating chessboard. The old chambers weren't sized for those boards. A standard miter gate might take 9 barges at a time. The rest, you double lock. Break the tow, push the first cut through, back out, reassemble, move the second cut, repin and shove forward. It's choreography in slow motion with steel cables and river current for a metronome. Every extra move is minutes. Minutes stack into hours. Hours stack into missed windows downstream. Now remember maintenance. One gate offline freezes a corridor like a jackknifed semi on an interstate with no shoulder. Hydraulic cylinders age, pintles wear, coin blocks need machining. If a bearing decides today's the day, a lock that should be a toll booth becomes a wall. Crews with wrenches and winches show up fast, but parts that were once catalog items are now custom jobs that ship on a truck from 3 states away. Upstream tows raft 3 deep and swap rumors on the radio. Dispatchers flip Gantt charts into prayer wheels. Sediment plays its own game. Pools behind dams look calm, but the river still moves sand. Flood pulses carry it in and lay it down. Low-flow years let bars grow where they're not invited. Dredge budgets chase fickle hotspots. One bend this month, the next bend 3 miles down next month. A cut cleared in June can fill by August after a single storm off the Iowa cornfields. That dance was tolerable when drafts held and calendars flexed. In 2022, when stages fell and barge quotes swung tilde 400% seasonally, every yard of uncut sand looked like a tax collector. On paper, modernization is simple. Bigger locks, longer chambers, tougher gates, and predictive maintenance that catches fatigue before a hinge whispers its last. On the ground, it's a decade-scale relay with traffic you can't stop. Try taking a major chamber out for 2 years in a river that carries harvest. You build a temporary bypass, stage parts like a moon mission, and pray the cofferdam doesn't meet a freak spring. Meanwhile, steel prices breathe with global markets, and appropriations run on election cycles, not hydrographs. Engineers do have better eyes now. Vibration sensors live on mitre gates, SCADA screens show pressure differentials like heart monitors, and LiDAR finds shoals before they scrape a hull. Software flags anomalies that used to be a gut feeling in a lockmaster's bones, but the bones still matter. A veteran can tell you which gate groans early in a south wind and which sill grabs a barge at 9 feet. That human map overlays the official one and keeps the staircase moving when the textbook says pause. Climate turns the staircase into a treadmill. High water stretches seasons, pins gates under loads they weren't sized to carry, and rattles coin posts loose enough that a diver has to drop into chocolate water to check a hinge. Low water does the opposite. It pulls flows thin so eddies behave wrong in the chamber, and a 15-barge cut walks sideways like a crab as wind gusts. Add ice in a winter that arrives late and leaves early, and you learn a new word, phrasal, slush that bullets into intakes and chews up pumps if screens aren't heated. The old design assumed normal winters and predictable springs. The new pattern shrugs at both. Legal overlays complicate fixes. Endangered species mined spawn windows. Navigation rights intersect with tribal treaties and riparian easements older than anyone alive. A drought emergency order might accelerate one dredge cut, while a fish kill upstream turns the next one into a hearing. The core schedules work like air traffic, landing planes in crosswinds. This is where compounding shows up. A lockdown for a week adds a queue, a barge grounded below stacks another, an elevator's take-or-pay clause comes due, basis widens, processing plants phone suppliers about missed deliveries. The staircase isn't just concrete, it's a timeline for counties. Modernization exists in binders, 120-foot chambers at key sites, automated mooring cells, bulkhead slots that speed deutering, composite gates that shrug at fatigue. Predictive maintenance can turn emergency dives into planned weekends. It buys minutes at every lock that turn into days by the Gulf. But you don't swap a century in a summer. You stage it over winters and shoulder seasons and hope the river behaves. Meanwhile, operators invent microfixes. A scout boat runs ahead to measure eddies in a bad crosswind. A tow shaves one barge from the nose to keep a cut straight in a fickle chamber. Lock crews pre-stage helper lines when a gusty front approaches. A dredge stays on site 2 extra days because a storm in Wisconsin reshaped a bend overnight. None of that makes a press release. It makes a system work 1 more week. Look at a map and you'll see blue lines. Look at a lock wall and you'll see the scuffs of a century of improvisation. The staircase still lifts commerce. It just creaks aloud now, asking for bigger steps, smarter hands, and schedules built around a river that refuses to be average. The grain, the steel, the chemicals, they all trust those gates. So do the towns that grew at their edges. When a hinge holds, a county gets paid. When it doesn't, the staircase reminds everyone it was built for a different beat. The vanishing delta, land loss, and levee logic. Down at the mouth, the river once wrote its own coastline. Every flood spilled over the banks, slowed into green, dropped mud, and built a maze of marsh that punched storms in the teeth. Then we made the river a pipe. Levees rose, edges hardened, and sediment shot straight to deep water. The delta began to sink without its annual meal. Sediment starvation isn't a metaphor. Upstream dams trap silt in quiet pools. Cutoffs and revetments speed what's left so fast it won't drop until the shelf falls away. The result is math you can feel in your boots. Marshes convert to open water, spoil banks become islands, and the map blinks out square miles like someone erasing a chalkboard. A fisherman points to a spot his grandfather anchored. There's no land to point at anymore. Nutrients ride the current differently. Farm winds upstream, more yield, fewer weather losses, send nitrogen and phosphorus down the ladder. In the Gulf, they turn into hypoxia, a seasonal dead zone where shrimp boats cross acres of quiet water that can't breathe. Ensure those loads tweak plant communities, thin root mats, and make a soft platform even softer. You don't see the chemistry on a satellite. You feel it in a boot that sinks deeper each year. Storm surge learns fast. Subsidence lowers the living floor, sea level rises beneath it. Levees keep the river out, but keep restoration flows out too. Surge rides passes deepened for bigger ships, finds the open water where marsh used to be, and charges the walls. Baselines creep. The new normal, high water lapse boards that once stayed dry. You can spend a fortune on height and still lose distance. Meanwhile, navigation decisions upstream sharpen the wedge's knife downstream. Deepening the Southwest Pass clears drafts for the global fleet and gives salt a smoother ramp. In 2023, when the river thinned, the first sill we threw at the wedge was overtopped. Crews built deeper. The delta didn't flinch. Every foot we carve for commerce is a foot the Gulf uses when discharge falters. Gains in one ledger right losses in another. We tried to correct course without surrendering the map. Bonnet Carré opens in flood to spare New Orleans and send a thin, fresh pulse into the lake. Smaller diversions tested the idea that you can mimic natural crevasses with gates and schedules. The proof sits where projects got enough water long enough. Shoals blooming into platform, Spartina knitting brown into green, birds and nurseries returning like a forgiveness. In a state built on levees, that's heresy that works. Then the clock cuts in. The delta sinks, seas rise, storms don't wait for line items to clear. Master plans stack projects, price sediment, and bookbuild timelines into a decade that won't stretch. The simple truth is brutal: not enough mud, not enough time. You can borrow from the river's future only by changing how the river runs. That means sediment diversions at scale, gates open long enough to move real tons, knowing fishers will hate the schedules and some places will get fresher before they get stable. Politics makes that math human. A shrimper with a 30-year net knows a fresh pulse can scatter his catch for a season. A parish president wants tax base today, not marsh 5 years out. An engineer draws a hydrograph that steals hours from open water to buy acres inland. Everyone's right, and still the tide keeps the schedule. The only constant is that the delta without river sediment is a rumor. Walk a back levee near Empire after a blow. Driftwood lines ride higher than last year. A camp once safe sits one cypress lower on the horizon. Somebody points at a break in the spoil bank where a small bubble of land grew after an unplanned crevasse, just mud and grass daring the Gulf to argue. The argument is old. The Gulf usually wins. Every little victory like that shows why the river matters. We can keep the channel tight and the ships deep and watch the edges fray, or we can risk letting the river breathe where it builds, using gates like lungs instead of locks. It won't look tidy. Fishers will relearn calendars. Turbidity will cloud places tourists wish were postcard blue, but land will stick where it fell. Storm lines will stall in green instead of at concrete. The delta's only friend is mud, on schedule, in volume, at the speed nature understands. The levee logic that saved cities wrote an IOU to the coast. Payment is overdue. The river can pay in silt, or the Gulf will collect in miles. Between those choices sits every house on a ridge, every cemetery behind a spoil bank, and 1,000 docks where engines cough at dawn. The delta isn't failing. Our old rulebook is. The scenarios: forks in the river's future. 3 doors, none clean, all expensive. Pick wrong and the river picks for you. First, the break we pretend won't happen. Old river control blinks, and gravity grabs the wheel. A capture into the Atchafalaya isn't cinematic, it's swift. Draft south of Baton Rouge thins in days. Pilots radio numbers nobody budgeted. Ports that lived by authorized depths become excavation projects. Intake towers, built to sip a steady trunk, face a steeper, shorter river that doesn't pause to be polite. The meter starts loud, roughly $295 million a day in immediate losses. Grain stacks inland, barges idle, refineries throttle, plastics slip. Then the losses stop being per day and become rewiring. Rail that can't scale pretends it can. Gulfside terminals, never sized for this, groan. Insurance adds a line called capture risk. The phrase Atchafalaya premium stops being a joke. Second, the hard medicine, a managed diversion, not a panic, but a plan that admits the physics and stages the shift. You treat Old River like an adjustable valve, not a vow. Over years, you lean into the Atchafalaya with gates, training walls, and dredge choreography that steers a controlled share south and builds new draft where you'll need it. Ports triage. Keep deep water where you can, grow at Morgan City and nearshore terminals, add lightering fleets as standard kit. Petrochemical intakes replumb for new elevations. Dual corridors for grain barge down both routes, rail to new blending points. Become policy, not contingency. It hurts, but the hurt has a schedule, and every memo has a date, not a shrug. Third, hold the line maximalism. Build higher, dredge deeper, armor more, thicker concrete at Old River, expanded overbank, smarter spill energy dissipation. Upstream, longer locks, predictive maintenance everywhere, dredge fleets on retainer. Downstream, permanent sills to fight the wedge, more passes dredged for bigger ships, pipelines and interconnects to move sweet water during wedge weeks. It buys time. It also buys a bill that spirals. The river's trend, hotter, leaner shoulders, burstier floods, keeps leaning back. You win months and lose years. Budgets follow sills into deeper water. People call it resilience. The river calls it delay. There's a fourth door that isn't a door so much as a hallway, adaptive split. Build redundancy into geography. Keep New Orleans and Baton Rouge viable, but grow a second deep draft Gulf posture along the Atchafalaya corridor. Treat ports like a portfolio, dual home cargoes, contracts with either delta clauses. Design petrochemical and grain logistics for two rivers on one ledger. It looks inefficient until a drought or a surge makes redundant feel like alive. Staged retreat sounds political. In practice, it's phased investment. Pilots trained for both routes, dredges based in both basins, rails and pipelines that don't panic when a sill is overtopped. Finance already knows how to price this if we let it. Cat bonds that trigger on hydrology, Tarbert landing discharge under X for Y days, wedge past River Mile 69, Old River gates in emergency alignment. Pay for emergency dredging, sills, and intake fixes without waiting on hearings. Parametric insurance covers barge idleness and elevator take or pay when drafts sit under 9 feet past a threshold. Export contracts carry river risk clauses, basis floors that lift when stage falls, staged fobs that automatically reroute tonnage at pre-agreed spreads. Risk funds price the Atchafalaya premium now, not in crisis. The question isn't whether money can adapt, it's whether law will let it. Politics is the drag coefficient. A managed diversion means telling towns and plants which calendar wins this decade and which waits. Hold the line means telling taxpayers they're buying time at compound interest. Adaptive split means admitting inefficiency is just what resilience looks like on maps. The only scenario that fails for sure is the one that treats yesterday's certainty as tomorrow's plan. People ask about the delta in these forks. Managed diversion is the only path that feeds it at scale. Open gates long enough to carry mud and the marsh answers, ports adjust to turbidity. Fishermen curse new calendars and learn new runs. It is costly, so is watching surge lines climb your levees. Upstream, locks and dams don't get a free pass in any scenario. Bigger chambers and predictive maintenance matter whether you hold, pivot, or split. A grounded toe in October hurts under every plan. Modernize the staircase or plan around its creaks with buffers and schedules that price slow. And the wedge, permanent sills become standard, not stunts. Interconnects between parishes go from rumors to bids. Pipelines to the Kenner hump get built when people accept the price tag is smaller than closing schools. DeSalle stays as last-mile armor, not a fantasy backbone. Here's the blunt line. We can choose a timeline where pain is scheduled and paid down, or we can wait for gravity to schedule it for us. The river has offered its terms for a century. The only fork we control is whether we listen before the car doors slam again. Designing for uncertainty, the playbook. The fix isn't heroics. It's 1,000 unglamorous moves that trade perfection for odds. Start with redundancy you can touch. A port director in reserve runs a tabletop drill. If drafts fall to 9 feet, grain loads split half to rail, half to smaller cuts with lightering skiffs staged on midstream flats. A refinery downriver signs a standing agreement with a pipeline neighbor to swap freshwater intakes for a week when chloride hums. Rail, barge, pipe, no single vein gets to be the plan anymore. Contracts learn to breathe too. Draft adaptive clauses reset volumes when stage drops, not after arguments. Up the staircase, modernization stops being a wish list. Locks that double lock today get smart tomorrow. Longer chambers where traffic justifies it. Automated mooring cells that shave minutes each cut. Bulkhead slots and standard panels pre-positioned so deutering isn't a saga. Predictive maintenance moves from pilots to policy. Vibration monitors on miter gates. Oil analysis on cylinders. LiDAR sweeps that find shoals before crews feel them. Quiet wins every day, compounded. Cities and parishes build seasonal storage like they mean it. Tanks and ponds sized for wedge weeks. Feeds that let treatment plants blend away a scare without begging barges on day one. Temporary sills become standard kit, not improvisations. Cold designs on pallets, rock stockpiles under tarps. Tow plans written in spring for work that might happen in fall. And a contingency line for overtopping sits in every binder. If the sill loses the first round, how fast do we cut deeper? Where do the excavators stage? Who calls the borrow pit? Markets help when we let them. Water swaps during wedge events, short hops between neighboring systems over interconnects that sit tested, not theoretical, turn scarcity into trades rather than press releases. Desal stays last mile, small skids married to hospitals and critical facilities, powered and plumbed, not a centerpiece fantasy. Ag logistics shift with the river's pulse. Elevators preposition empties inland. Stagger harvest with bonuses for early and late delivery windows. Pool barges across co-ops so one rumor doesn't break 3 counties. One tow company rewrites dispatch. Every morning meeting starts with 3 screens, stage, wind, and dredge. A barge fleet buys more smaller units to thread one-way windows without turning the whole string into a parking lot. A pilot union builds a bench trained for both deltas, old trunk and atchephalia, because redundancy on paper means nothing if the people steering don't know the turns. Downriver, plant managers design for salinity like coastal engineers. Intakes sit on rails, so pump bells can ride up when the wedge lurks below. Materials shift, duplex stainless where old carbon steel invited pitting, coatings that tolerate a few bad days without turning into leaks. Cooling systems accept lower cycles when chemistry says no, backed by on-site storage that carries an afternoon without flirting with permits. Maintenance schedules turn wedge weeks into planned calm. No gaskets left to luck when chloride wanders. Parishes treat interconnects as lifelines, not headlines. Valves get exercised under load every quarter. Pumps tested against head and flow, not just turned on to hear a hum. SCADA dashboards live on walls in rooms with people in them, watching conductivity and intake temperature beside chlorine residuals, not in a folder that opens after a problem. The pipeline to the Kenner hump stops being a drawing when budgets accept its price as cheaper than panic. Ports invest in lightering as a capability, not a rescue. Fleeting areas expand where eddies behave, mooring cells go in where they should have been, and tug contracts include surge clauses that pay enough to keep boats available when drafts fall. Dredge vendors sit on retainer with pre-cleared permits for cuts everyone knows will need attention. Each winter becomes a construction season with a menu, not a wish. Policy tunes what habits can't. Tow size caps in low water keep bends from becoming gridlock. Temporary one-way windows get scripted by milepost and hour, coordinated in advance, so pilots aren't negotiating fairness on Channel 4. A barge rate index links to stage automatically, no surprises, so elevators can explain to growers why basis moved. Cat bonds fund emergency sills and dredging when parametric triggers hit. Discharge under X for Y days at Tarbert. Wedge past mile 69 with chloride over thresholds. Money that lands fast keeps excavators moving. Industry agrees on a wedge playbook. Reverse osmosis skids pre-contracted, filters and membranes stockpiled across a corridor, mutual aid between plants that once competed. If your intake stays sweet, you lend pumps and crews to the neighbor whose didn't. Insurance discounts follow the playbook. Surcharges land when it's performative. Culture does the rest. Cities outlaw non-functional turf and mean it. HOAs rewrite covenants, shade over sprinklers, backed by rebates that hire local crews, not just glossy mailers. Builders plumb greywater loops standard and stub reclaimed stubs at the curb. Hospitals, schools, and grocery warehouses sit atop critical lists for interconnect priority. Lifeline indoor use gets a floor 8. Pools, fountains, and lush frontage learn the price of a dry September. None of this makes the river obey. It makes our promises honest. We stop pricing certainty and start financing options. We stop praying for average and start rehearsing the edges. The playbook isn't about winning. Pricing is about not losing the same way twice. With flow. We built a system that prices certainty. The river keeps sending invoices for risk. If we want this to pencil, money has to move with water, not with wishes. Start on a dispatch desk where a port director stares at a gauge and a spreadsheet. Draft is 9 feet today, maybe 10 tomorrow if the wind shifts. A static tariff makes no sense. So the dock flips to variable tolling tied to stage. Cheaper when drafts are fat, pricier when the river is stingy. Incentives kick in for lightering, bring a smaller cut, pay less per ton, clear the bend without turning the queue into a parking lot. It's not punishment. It's a price signal that keeps traffic from tripping over itself. Insurers finally stop pretending hydrology is a footnote. Policies link premiums to discharge bands and wedge position. Underwriters read Tarbot landing like a credit report. If old river gates sit in emergency alignment or the wedge crosses a published mile marker, surcharges trigger automatically. No calls, no bargaining. Operators who share telemetry, draft sensors, AIS discipline, intake conductivity, earn discounts because transparency lowers guesswork. In 2022, when spot barge rates jumped roughly 400%, lenders learned fast. Now covenants flex with stage, a low-water rider that loosens coverage tests when the gauge says 9 feet but sweeps cash when it rises. Debt survives because terms breathe. Catastrophe bonds stop being novelty. Parametrics do the job simple and quick. If discharge at Tarbot stays under a threshold for a set number of days, if chloride at an intake exceeds limits, if old river control shifts into emergency gate choreography, a tranche pays. That money lands in a dedicated account with one purpose: keep dredges and sills moving, prepare interconnect pumps, replace membranes and gaskets before alarms turn into outages. Investors like it because there's no adjuster whispering later. Crews like it because excavators don't sit while committees argue. Export contracts learn the river's language. Basis floors lift automatically when stage dips. Staged fobs specify backup ports and price spreads if drafts stay tight past a date. A grain buyer in Cairo knows he's paying an extra nickel when the Ohio starves the trunk. A shipper in Baton Rouge knows a vessel will reroute to the Atchafalaya corridor if a sill is overtopped twice in 7 days. The clause reads cold. In practice, it buys honesty. No one is surprised by fees that were already inevitable. Public dashboards become habit. Discharge, drafts, wedge position, queue miles, they live on a page that phones load without passwords. A barge dispatcher glances before he bids. An elevator manager checks before she calls trucks at midnight. A parish official pulls the wedge map before ordering pallets of water. Visibility buys calm. Panic grows in silence. Then price the waste. Non-functional turf pays a seasonal rate that makes a homeowner choose shade over sprinklers. Decorative fountains cut checks to the meter that reads like July every day. Critical indoor use gets a lifeline tier, enough for health at a price that doesn't humiliate. Then block tariffs rise steeply for pools and lawns when the river shrinks. Affordability programs don't vanish. They target life, not display. Finance down the corridor adjusts too. A petrochemical plant's intake risk becomes a line item. Facilities with adjustable intakes, materials that tolerate chloride spikes, and tested interconnects see lower insurance. Those without pay. A refinery that still assumes freshwater every day of September in New Orleans pays more than one with a pipeline stub aimed at the Kenner hump. Bond buyers reward assets with wedge playbooks. They penalize nostalgia. Barge fleets hedge differently. Freight derivatives linked to stage now, not just diesel. A low-water swap pays the operator when drafts stay under 10 feet for 2 weeks, cushioning crews' wages and maintenance while strings idle. Elevators buy the other side when bins are full and they need to keep tickets printing. Everyone stops pretending the river is average. Cities write deals that pay for readiness. A water system with tested interconnects contracts with neighbors for standby flow at a published price per million gallons, plus a retainer that keeps pumps maintained. A clause adds a surcharge if a wedge crosses a mile marker earlier than the 5-year median. The river moves fast, the money does too. Markets aren't morals, they are mirrors. When we tie tolls, premiums, covenants, and contracts to stage and salinity, we stop lying to ourselves about what control costs. The river still breaks routine, but the system stops breaking the same way. You can see it in small moments. A dispatch flips a load to lightering because the tariff nudged it. An insurer sends a check without a site visit because the trigger was met. A parish turns a valve because the price on the screen says today is the day. Pricing reality doesn't fix physics. It aligns our promises with the flow that keeps them. Micro Stories lives on a moving river. Night on Wilkerson Point, and a tow pilot named Harris watches the gauge like a metronome that won't keep time. The window is one way, 9 feet on the mark, wind wrong for his bend. 36 hours on catnaps and bad coffee, he threads a 12-barge cut through a shoal that ate steel last week. The radio stays polite because it has to. He whistles under his breath when the keel brushes sand, then exhales when the stern clears. He learned to treat inches like payroll. At the Plaquemines Clinic, Nurse LeBlanc keeps 2 calendars, shifts and chloride. Dialysis patients sit in chairs that hum, lines taped neat, while she checks the conductivity screen the way a pilot checks altitude. During the 209-day emergency, she moved appointments to mornings after sills were cut deeper and barges topped tanks. On one bad Thursday, she handed out bottled water with discharge instructions. "This isn't panic," she said softly, "it's timing." Midnight rings in Pike County. Elevator manager Carla stares at the river forecast and calls farmers by first name. There's a 6-inch rise coming, a 12-hour shot to clear one more string. Trucks line a gravel lot by 4 a.m., headlights pointed at the pit. Her crew jokes about buying cots. By noon, the dredge upriver pivots to another bend and the window snaps shut. She writes bonuses in blue ink for the early risers. Across from a fleeting area near reserve, a drayage crew plays rumor and stage. The dispatcher refreshes the core map like a day trader, toggles between rail and barge orders, and reads the tow queue length as gospel. Last season, spot barge quotes swung 400%. Today's bid is merely ugly. A driver shrugs and says what everyone is thinking, cheaper than stuck. At a JSMA refinery, night shift tech Murillo tilts his head toward a pump and hears strain you don't see on a screen. Chloride nudged up at dusk. They dropped cycles in cooling and swapped to the spare heat exchanger at midnight. He sets a corrosion coupon on the workbench and traces its pitted moonscape with a finger. "That was 3 bad weeks," he says. He keeps a second coupon taped to a locker, unscarred, as a promise. Simisport VFD runs drills by the low sill. Volunteers practice traffic control on the levee road, lights, cones, a calm wave, because when gate alignments change, trucks wander close to fences for a look. The captain reminds them what 1973 sounded like. If you feel it in your chest, move the crowd back before they feel it in their teeth. In St. Bernard, Mr. Torres tapes a note by the kitchen sink. "Oil for baby, bottled for grandma." The wedge had eased, but trust lags graphs by weeks. He keeps a crate of half-liter bottles under the table like a superstition. When the city cofferdam plan hits the news, he circles numbers he doesn't quite believe and tells his wife, "I just want the hum to be boring again." Deckhand Riley on the MV Violet counts his steps from stern line to headline, 22 at a jog, 27 with a coil. He tells a greenhorn how to throw a line in wind that spins the first cut, how to feel a barge settle when the chamber eddies wrong, how to listen for a hitch in the engine that means the skipper is nursing a bend. He learned to read the river by the way steel talks. Up by Prairieville, Amya rinses school lunch trays from a blue tub because the dishwasher line acts funny when chloride wobbles. Kids don't notice the sub. They notice the fan and the extra bottle on every table. She keeps a pocket spiral of notes, deliveries logged, RO filters swapped, jokes the 4th graders told her. It's logistics, small and constant. On a back road outside New Roads, Mr. Arsenault pulls over to watch old rivers flat shine. He grew sugar and beans, his grandson works on a dredge. He spits, smiles, and says what no map prints. That concrete listens, the Gulf doesn't, we live between them. He taps the wheel when a barge train slides by, low and careful, like a promise being kept one more night. The old promise versus a new map, what we must admit. We told ourselves a clean story, We straightened a wild river, locked it to a number, and won. Levees would hold, locks would lift, dredges would keep the draft. Commerce could count on a schedule. People could build lives behind a promise. That promise built farms, plants, towns, and habits. It also blurred a truth that keeps showing up in steel and mud. The river never signed that contract. Start with the illusion of normal. There isn't one anymore. Variability is the baseline. Shoulder seasons slip. The Ohio and Tennessee decide what the lower Mississippi can't do weeks later. The wedge doesn't ask for late notice. Storms arrive in clumps, then leave nothing but sun and heat that pull the river down from the edges. Every average we used to design with is a ghost. The graphs don't lie. The water just doesn't care. Old river control is the purest version of our bet against physics. We built a box to force a 70-30 split and declared the marriage permanent. Gravity has spent 60 years arguing back. In 1973, the argument flashed loud. A football field-sized scour hole, roughly 50 feet deep, ripped under the low sill. Vibrations slammed car doors on the bridge. The fix held. The warning stayed. Since then, every flood pulse, every low water emergency, every gate alignment that wasn't routine has whispered the same thing. This split is maintenance, not law. The river remembers the shorter, steeper path. We only delay the memory. Control in this century is probabilistic, expensive, and temporary. That isn't defeatism, it's math. We can raise sills and deepen channels and modernize locks. We should. But each win buys months, not permanence. Each fix comes with a bill that compounds. More dredge hours, more armor, more spare parts staged for a weather that won't pick a lane. Every time we plan like it's 1965, the invoice lands like it's 2026. If that sounds like loss, reframe it. The models don't require surrender. They require humility and redundancy. Energy that relies on predictable intake chemistry needs a second straw and materials that tolerate a few bad days. Food that expects 80,000 bushels per barge in September needs contracts that pay for lightering and rail to catch the overflow without panic. Trade that assumes one deep lane to one delta needs two lanes in its playbook and capex that reflects either or not only. That's not waste. That's survival in a narrow band between salt and silt. The wedge forced the same lesson in slow motion. We learned that a sill is a tool, not a guarantee. We learned pipelines beat press conferences. We learned that reverse osmosis is last-mile armor, not a backbone. We learned you can't outsource trust. It grows back one test at a time after the graph turns green. We learned pipelines to the Kenner hump cost less than months of improvisation, and interconnects that click under load are worth more than 10 memos. Upstream, the staircase of locks told us something quieter. Modernization is not glamour. It's minutes shaved at a chamber that turn into days saved by the time a toe meets tide. Sensors on miter gates keep a hinge from becoming a headline, and longer chambers keep a harvest from becoming a backlog. If it sounds small, remember what harvest feels like in a scale house when the whiteboard says, "One more string before noon," and the river agrees. Admitting uncertainty doesn't shrink us. It makes our math honest. The faster we stop pricing certainty, the cheaper the future gets. A port that charges by stage instead of pretending every day is fat water moves cargo before the queue becomes a parking lot. A barge fleet hedging drafts keeps crews paid and engines maintained when the gauge reads 9 feet. Cat bonds that pay sills and dredges when discharge crosses a line keep excavators digging while meetings catch up. Export contracts that move spreads when stages dip-stop, turning panic into litigation. New map isn't just lines, it's posture. Dual home cargo so grain can slide to the Atchafalaya corridor when Old River breathes hard. Train more pilots to run both deltas. Stage dredges in both basins. Build fleeting areas where eddies behave in bad wind so one grounding doesn't eat half a day. Set temporary tow caps in low water without making pilots improvise fairness on Channel 4. Put wedge playbooks on plant walls and make insurance discounts prove they're real. Down at the edge where land meets tide, honesty is brutal and simple. The delta's only friend is mud. If we want a coast that blunts storms instead of inviting them, gates have to act like lungs, not walls. Open long enough to move tons, not tweets. Fishers will hate the timing until they learn the new runs. Water will look brown where postcards want blue. Land will stick. That trade is the only one the Gulf respects. We also owe people a different kind of promise. A lifeline indoor tier that doesn't humiliate. outdoor water that costs enough to make shade win over sprinklers, dialysis chairs that don't move for surprises, a tow pilot who doesn't live on catnaps every September, a scale house that doesn't run midnight calls off a rumor, a refinery tech whose corrosion coupon stays smooth because a pipeline valve turned on time. None of that is resilience. It's basic. The old promise said we fixed the river. The new map says we live with it, not as passengers, but as neighbors who know which nights to listen, which mornings to move, and which risks to pay before they turn into stories. If you want a proverb for a century like this, plan by the trickle, not the headline. The trickle told Plaquemines what 209 days feel like. It told a pilot how a keel scrapes at 9 feet. It told a lockmaster which gate groans wrong in a south wind. It will tell us where to spend and where to stop pretending. Remember 1973's scour hole and the car doors that slammed? That wasn't a fluke. It was a postcard from physics. We can frame it and keep pointing, or we can read it and start moving furniture. Either way, the knock is still on the door. It will keep knocking. Our choice is whether the answer is late and loud or early and boring. The river isn't failing, our certainty is, and a $12.6 trillion habit still leans on a promise the water never made. The fix is humility written into contracts, concrete, and calendars. If you want the chapter where old rivers' gates decide which delta breathes and what a planned capture really looks like, watch next. Subscribe for the maps, meters, and deals that will decide who moves and who waits. Your click funds the fieldwork and keeps the pressure on the people holding the gauges.